All right, welcome to the podcast. I am honored to have attorney Megan Cow on this podcast to specifically talk about Michael Miske. So, her career path has been very interesting and it qualifies her in a rather unique way to speak on this. She's a Punahou girl, but she didn't have a silver spoon in her mouth. She worked her way up from basically nothing. She went to UH Law School, ran for city prosecutor, is now a defense attorney as well as she does some of the civil stuff. But at one time, she was actually a prosecutor. So she has the perspective of both sides when it comes to this matter. So I'm honored and privileged to welcome Megan to the podcast. How's it going? Good morning.
Thank you, Nick. So, two things.
Two
I went to
things.
Santa Clara Law School.
Ah,
I went to UH undergrad and got a bachelor's in accounting,
okay. I
became a
forgot that.
CPA.
Oh,
Yeah, and
yeah, yeah,
then
yeah.
went to law school at Santa Clara University.
Okay. Yeah, I messed that up. Yeah, I
Really?
forgot about all that. It's been a while.
Yeah,
It's been a while
it's
since
been a
we've been,
while.
yeah,
Yeah.
on a podcast. No, I remember back when you ran for city prosecutor, I like had a whole bunch of notes on you, and that all makes sense. That all makes sense. But yeah, I wanted to format things and give everybody kind of like a tease of what to expect. The main event is going to be us talking about the $25 million in assets that the government is trying to seize, or I guess we'll call it the Mitski estate or trust. But before that, I kind of wanted to talk about the, I guess, death or suicide, or I don't really know what to call it right now, the overdose from fentanyl. Firstly, what are your thoughts or your opinions on the current status of how Mr. Mitski died?
Okay, so I have to say before we start that any
Hmm.
information or anything that we discuss, nothing is derived from any attorney-client privilege information, whatever that may be, because I do represent some of the co-defendants in the case. And at one point I represented an LLC owned by Delia Favreau Miske. So none of the information or nothing that we discussed today has anything to do with anything that I learned through that representation. So I have to say that. Okay.
Very good.
So I'm convinced Michael Miske committed suicide. Convinced.
That's different than what you said earlier.
It is. So when I first found out, I was shocked because he intended to appeal everything. He fought everything, never cooperated. My understanding is got into a disagreement with John Stansel right before the trial started because John Stansel ended up pleading guilty, which caused movement at the federal detention center. So it was a big deal that Michael Miske decided to go to trial and fight everything. And then it was my understanding he intended to appeal everything. I think he even called the news media with a letter that said, I'm going to appeal everything. So when I first heard about it, not knowing the potential consequences of the forfeiture, I was shocked. But since then, I've learned many things.
This case has been going on since COVID, and he's been in custody since approximately 2020. But the case is even older, right? Like going
Right.
way back into like maybe 2013, 2014. That's when I first had my professional interactions with Mr. Mitski. And fast forward to the conviction, basically he is proven guilty by a court of law of like racketeering, murder for hire, kidnapping, the chemical attack at the nightclub, like a whole bunch of stuff that was so substantial that he was basically looking at being in custody for the rest of his life, right?
Correct. His sentence was a life in prison sentence. And with the federal life in prison sentence, there's no such thing as parole or good time for life sentences. You actually serve your life sentence in the federal system.
Oh, wow. You know what? That's kind of interesting because there's a big difference between the state system and the federal system. The federal system has that I guess, calculator. Could you explain a little bit more about how they calculate the amount of time that you end up serving?
Sure. So in our Hawaii state system, you're charged with either a Class A, Class B, or Class C felony. Each of those has an indeterminate maximum amount of prison. Class A is a 20-year prison term, Class B is a 10-year prison term, and Class C is a 5-year prison term. The federal system is completely different from this. We have to do a calculation called the sentencing offense level. And what goes into that calculation is several different factors. Is there a certain type of victim? Is there a certain type of drug involved? Is there a certain money amount involved? Are you a leader? Are you a manager? Are you were you minimally involved? And so all of these factors lead us to conclude that your offense level is a certain number. Then what we do is we look at the chart, the sentencing table, and we look at the x-axis and the y-axis. One axis is your offense level, the other axis is your criminal history category. And based on where we end up on that chart, there is a recommendation of a certain amount of months that the court will consider in determining the appropriate sentence.
A very thorough and complete answer, which is why I enjoy having you on because you could fill in the gaps that I clear because I didn't go to law school. And even if I went to law school, I don't think I could recite everything kind of like at a near photographic memory level. So thank you for that. So I wrote a newsletter. I sat on some information for like maybe 2 or 3 weeks. I'm not sure if I texted you or talked to you about my conspiracy theory, but from the newsletter, I guess I'll just lay it out and then get your reactions. So, first thing is, I think people need to not be talking about this. I can't believe I got this information. And if what I wrote in the newsletter is true, people need to not talk about this. I can't believe. So I heard from several people that the morning of Miski's passing, he was found in his cell, sort of like stiff as a board. Like I guess there's some sort of rigor mortis that could happen to your body and you could stiffen up. And he was supposedly with an iPad either still in his hands or resting on his chest, sort of in his hands. And nobody really talks about, and we'll see if this is actually true, but supposedly he had a cellmate. And the morning of his passing, the cellmate just kept to himself, went to go get breakfast, which was kind of interesting for me to hear. I didn't know they just opened the cells in federal custody. You could just go get breakfast and come back. Obviously, I've never been in federal custody, but I was like surprised that they just let people out and you can go get breakfast and come back. And apparently, Mr. Mitski did not go out to get breakfast. And then when his cellmate came back, discovered him stiff as a board with the iPad next door. And if this is true, how is this even possible? Supposedly, his half brother, John Stansel, was in the adjoining cell, like next adjacent cell. The cellmate uh quickly went and got the stepbrother. Sorry, is it a half brother or stepbrother?
Half brother.
Half brother. He tried to perform some sort of CPR and then told the cellmate to go get, help. And then that was how Mike was discovered, you know, having passed away. And then I guess a few weeks later, the autopsy report says it was a fentanyl overdose. So that story that I heard from two sources, do you think any of that's true, or how realistic do you think that that actually happened that way?
Nothing about that surprises me at all.
Really?
First of all, so first of all, Michael Miske did have access to laptops technology. He was given a specific order because his discovery was so extensive. They did give him privileges. So I would not be surprised if he had a laptop or an iPad. I honestly don't know what he actually had access to via this order, but it wouldn't surprise me if it gave him access to a laptop. His discovery was extremely extensive.
Mm. Yeah, gigabytes
John
and gigabytes,
Stansel,
right? Like
yeah,
over 50
yeah,
gigabytes of like files.
yeah. John Stansel also had access because he had the same discovery and was preparing for trial up until his plea, obviously. So the second thing that doesn't surprise me is um, he was laying down, and the way the count is done at Honolulu FDC is it's a bed check. So if the guards look in, as long as you're in your bed, then at certain checkpoints, then they don't go in to make sure that you're okay. There's one standing checkpoint, and I believe that's later on in the morning, 10 o'clock. But I cannot confirm that. I haven't looked into that in a long time. So, if the roommate thought that he was sleeping and left for breakfast and came back and realized he wasn't sleeping, but he was dead, then nothing about that would surprise me.
Wow. And I feel as though there's cameras everywhere from, I guess, the people I hang out with that have done federal time. And I've been told that there's cameras everywhere. I've been told from people that serve time that it was annoying how many checks that they had because they're very like they're paying a lot of attention to the welfare of the inmates. So I don't want to paint the federal detention center as a place that's uh inherently so dangerous, even though it is. But it was like annoying. Like they would want to just sleep and hang out, but then they'd have to have a check. Or you could be like not at risk and you might have like a special meeting with a warden's assistant of some sort, and you could talk about your mental health and your welfare just so that they could keep an eye out to make sure that you're not the type of person who might be at risk to commit suicide.
Yeah, and what's important to note was he wasn't in the shoe, right? He wasn't in special holdings. He was in his cell. And so I believe there's three checks a day. Two of them are cell checks. Make sure you're in your bed in your cell, and one of them is standing.
Mm. Okay. So I heard, and I guess conspiracy theorists in me has to bring this up. So I knew enough about Mike from our professional interactions because just in case people don't know, I bailed him out a few times, and I have, of course, you don't see the many sides of somebody. I just saw the side of the person that I could help clear bench warrants and guarantee that he goes to court, give appearances, try to make sure he doesn't get ambushed by the media when he's just trying to self-surrender. And, ideally, you don't also add a perp walk in there as well. But my interactions with him was one where anytime I got phone calls from him, and I did get phone calls from him when he's getting pulled over, I got phone calls about turning in. I would see him out and about in town because his club was right across the street from the courthouse. So you would catch him here and there. I never saw a guy doing drugs. He was not, I don't think, I feel like everybody has had alcohol, but I don't think he's a drug user at all. Yet somehow he overdoses on fentanyl. I never saw anything close to him doing drugs. Have you heard anything about drug use with Mr. Mitski?
Not at all. There was never any type of allegation, any type of rumor, any type of street talk that he was a user. I mean, I did make a comment on the news one time that he was not known to be a drug user. And people email, send text messages, DMs, and the person, I don't even know the person's name, said, I'm not sure why you said that on the news because everybody knew that Michael Miske did blow. And I mean,
Maybe. I don't know.
uh, he was not known to be a drug user. None of the charges related to drug use, none of the allegations in the trial related to drug use. They all related to making money, being a business person, being at the top of his game. And typically, fentanyl users are not at the top of your game.
And to get ready for this podcast, I did look at his e-court Kokua records, which is all the different cases. Man, that guy had a whole bunch of traffic cases. And I remember getting calls when he's getting pulled over. And I know he had a target on his back because the fact that he got charged for a Class C felony and it was just an assault case and they jacked up his bail to $250,000. I know if they could have, they would have found cause to arrest him for driving under the influence. I'm sure if they could have searched and found drugs on him, they would have been stoked. Law enforcement would have been stoked. But out of the dozens and dozens of traffic cases he had, and I had like maybe half a dozen calls during pullovers. I know that they're testing and trying to get him for something, yet they never caught him for DUI and never caught him having any drugs on him, being high at all.
Yep. And typically if you drink a lot, you do drugs, blow, whatever, you're partying a lot, you're gonna get pulled over at least once for a DUI. But to your point, he never did.
Yeah, so that'll be important. In fact, maybe we'll just get to it next. I wanted to save the asset part as like the main event, but this is all leading there. So to lay more background, we have a business person, entrepreneur, um, one really good company, Kama Aina Termite, which was, I think, the profit center, but he also did solar installations on really big scale. He had a plumbing company. He had the club that was making lots of money. And on paper, for sure, he was a legitimate businessman. But then there was that other side that maybe local people knew about, the crime boss side, the underground economy side that people knew about. We've already established that he was not a drug user because even though some people are like saying, "Oh yeah, he does this and that," I've never seen it, and he it was just over too long of a period. So for our listeners, can you explain what happens when somebody passes away after conviction but before sentencing and how that would affect any forfeiture or seizure of assets?
Sure. So a jury can convict someone of a bunch of crimes, or a judge can convict someone of a bunch of crimes. That just means that the judge or the jury has found a defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The next step, typically 3 to 4 months after the finding of guilt, is sentencing. And at the sentencing portion, the judge imposes an appropriate sentence, which, if there's a forfeiture action, includes an order of forfeiture, which means this is the final order that says the government now has possession and ownership of assets that have been forfeited. That never happened in Michael Miske's case. He never went to sentencing. So he passed away in between his guilty verdict and his sentencing. And so because he was never sentenced, everything gets set aside. In other words, everything is deleted as if it never happened before. There's no conviction, there's no forfeiture action. And so this $25 million is basically up in the air.
Wow, that is crazy. And from what I've read and heard, because everybody's got an opinion, apparently the case law is rather strong that since the case has been vacated slash deleted, it's probable that they can't seize the assets. What do you think is like the algebra on that?
Okay, well, seizure is different. So the
Hmm.
United States government has these assets in its possession. So the government already has the $25 million in its possession. What it doesn't have is ownership. The United States cannot sell the property. The United States cannot use the funds, the 600,000 plus in cash. So it's frozen. So while the United States has these in its possession, it can't use them. So instead, what's happened is since the criminal forfeiture action has been set aside or deleted now, the government has chosen, or the government has now filed a civil forfeiture action.
In the world of, I guess, asset seizure slash forfeiture. There's a huge difference when the government has to stake a claim to get something versus when they already have it and then you have to sort of petition to get it back. So right now we're in a situation where the attorneys for Michael Miske have to, I guess, petition to get the seized assets back. Is that correct?
Well, I'm not really sure. So practically speaking, because we're talking about such a large amount of assets, I don't really know if a court is going to be willing to return all of those assets to Michael Miske's representative. Well, first of all, it's not clear to me that he has one, right? So all of this was being held in trust.
Hmm.
So what that means is that the successor trustee is now the person that represents Michael Miske. That successor trustee needs to hire a different lawyer, basically, to make a claim that these assets should now be put in the possession of the Michael Miske Trust. I haven't seen that happen yet. All we see right now is a forfeiture action filed by the government.
Do you think maybe there's information that we don't know about when it comes to the trust? Do you think he had this lined up? Because my impression of him was he was detail oriented and had things like this dialed in.
Well, I think what happened was during the criminal trial, the AUSAs were able to connect each of the assets to criminal activity. And
Hmm.
so the 12 jurors found beyond a reasonable doubt now, right? Beyond a reasonable doubt in the criminal trial that the assets were in fact connected to illegal activity, which allowed them to forfeit the assets in the criminal case. It's important to note now, though, in the civil forfeiture action, the burden of proof for the government is much less. It's preponderance of the evidence. So while we're going through this exercise of, repeating the criminal trial, the government has a much lower burden of standard, lower burden of proof that it needs to follow. Is it more likely than not that these assets were tied to illegal activity? And that's all they have to prove. If they were able to prove it to 12 jurors beyond a reasonable doubt, I don't see why they're not going to be able to prove it to less than 12 jurors in a civil case by preponderance of the evidence.
Hmm.
That's the question. So, I mean, I hear you. I hear that, there's a position that he was doing illegal things and that's how he initially came up with the money. But based on the verdict by the 12 jurors, it seems like he was continuing to do illegal activity and that those assets were specifically tied to criminal activity.
Yeah, I guess the umbrella term criminal activity. To me, I almost feel like if you're to kind of be a surgeon and dial in specifically the the things that he owned and directly connect them to the sale of drugs or some sort of illegal activity. I almost feel like as a blanket or an umbrella term, yeah, I guess you could kind of say that because of all the things about Michael Miske as, the biggest crime boss in Hawaii for since I won't say, but probably the biggest crime boss in the last maybe 20, 25 years, something like that. But then part of me also knows a little bit about him, has researched a little bit about him, and I feel as though just as there's that part that the government proved, there's also the part where, I mean, Kama termite made him a millionaire. He's making probably several $100,000 a month, you know what I mean? Through the legitimate contracts and services rendered through Kama pest control. That club that he had was the hottest club for a few years, right? And
Yep,
in
absolutely.
yeah, in that world, I haven't been out doing, the whole bottle service thing, but I remember people spend hundreds, if not thousands of dollars on a night on alcohol, and the people working there are walking away with hundreds of dollars in tips, sometimes over $1,000. You like the bottle service girls and all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, man, it's hard for me to imagine him not being able to counter with legitimate records of contracts signed and work rendered and revenue and cash on hand through banks and tax returns because there's no tax evasion, right? The IRS didn't
Well,
catch
there
him
was
for
a
anything.
well, there was a tax case. Yeah,
Oh, there
so
was?
which I won't get into because I represent someone in that case. So I we
Oh,
won't
okay.
get into, but there
Okay.
was allegations of underreporting income. But in response to that, what I'll say is he's getting a second bite at the apple. This
Mm-hmm.
is why I am convinced that it was suicide, because had he gone through its sentencing and appealed, he would have had almost a zero chance of winning that appeal and setting aside the forfeiture order. Instead, because he passed away before he was sentenced, he now gets a second bite at the apple.
Mm-hmm.
So his trust is going to have to hire a lawyer, a trial attorney that is versed in criminal cases as well as civil cases to fight the forfeiture action to see if there's some technicality that they can argue to get those assets back in the possession of the trust.
Yeah, that'd be a great job. If I could get the documents, drag and drop it into Chat GPT or Gemini or like just see if there's any angle that we could talk about. It seems super complex and very difficult.
Well, so it's basically redoing the whole trial all over again with a lower burden of proof and with
Oh.
civil rules instead of criminal rules. And so because he gets this second bite at the apple, he can try to see if the government's going to make a mistake. His
Mm-hmm.
best bet is going to be having Lynn Panagakis work with a civil attorney because she's criminal defense,
Mm-hmm.
so a civil attorney that is experienced in trials to try to find fukas in this civil forfeiture action.
Wow, that's gonna be quite a challenge, man.
In addition, the government has the burden to give notice to any potential beneficiaries. So number one, the government got to figure out who that is. I mean, obviously it includes granddaughter, right? Kayla Miske's daughter. So she'll have to retain counsel. Maybe Delia Fabro Miske is a potential beneficiary. She'll have to retain counsel. The trust itself will have to retain counsel. Any other living heirs or potential heirs of Michael Miske, his mother, she's a potential interested party. So the government, number one, has to figure out who these people are, and number two, has to serve them. And
Mm-hmm.
if the government fails to do that, it's a puka.
Mm-hmm. Wow, yeah. So there's fighting and winning a case with the law and I guess the mechanics and procedures of the law. And if one little thing wasn't done according to the law, that could louse up an entire attempt to seize or retain seizure of those assets, right?
Yep, that's right.
Wow. Um, just a random question. It seems like in jail there's way too much contraband, and I know I have a lot of respect for longtime public defender Ali Sievert. He broke the Kealoha case. I think he's one of the great, legal figures also in the last few decades because that case was so huge and it was like that one little string that you tug on that's like, whoa, all this. And then he was amazing throughout the whole process. But then him, as well as another attorney who works with the government, it's like, oh, yeah, in custody, you don't really have these issues where there's contraband. I don't see how we could have got this in. But then when I talk to my friends who serve time, they're like, dude, there's so much stuff that sneaks into the federal detention center, and there's so many various ways to do it. Is there any sort of liability that the feds take when drugs get into a facility that aren't supposed to have drugs and then somebody dies?
Well, if someone was going to bring a lawsuit against the FDC for that, they would have the burden of proving by a preponderance of the evidence that the FDC's policies and procedures made the FDC negligent. Right. So that's very difficult because FDC is run extremely well. It's a well-oiled machine. They're very strict. And so they have policies and procedures that prevent people from bringing things in. But of course, policies and procedures are not 100% guarantees. There's always going to be someone that can sneak something in a boot or a bra strap
Mm-hmm.
without getting detected because really they're looking for metal. right? So everything goes through the X-ray machine and you walk through a metal detector. But it's they don't search every single person that goes through there. It's random.
I think in a weird way, and as I wrote my newsletter, it was kind of a noble gesture to commit suicide to enable his trust to get a higher percentage chance at getting his assets, and is also like a final fuck you to the government, to try to make it as difficult as possible to lose those assets. How far off do you think that conspiracy? Because when I first published it a few weeks ago, it was like crazy. How far off do you think I was? Do you think that's, you don't have to give me a percentage, likely, unlikely, crazy,
I mean,
tinfoil
I think
hat?
I think you're completely spot on. Two
Yeah.
things. He was very calculated and
Yes.
intelligent. You know, he didn't get to where he is from being sloppy and unintelligent. So
Mm.
obviously he's very calculated. And number two, it was a big fuck you to the government because now look, they got to go through the whole procedure all over again. They basically have to redo the criminal trial in civil court. So you're spot on. That's exactly what's going on here.
Okay. I don't know. I got like a lot of pushback on that when I talk to people about it, and they're like, "What are you talking about?" So, um, do you think it's possible that he just out of the blue started experimenting with fentanyl? Is that likely,
No,
unlikely?
I don't think that at all. I don't think he
Uh,
was strung out. I think
uh,
he calculated, I think what happened was he met with Lynn Panagakis and his Nevada attorney. They talked to him about the potential outcomes of moving forward with a sentencing and appeal versus passing away and setting aside the forfeiture action. And he decided to use fentanyl to kill himself to give him a higher percentage of chance for his granddaughter to have access to the $25 million.
wow. In a weird way, there's a nobility in that, right?
Michael Miske was a business person,
Mm.
intelligent and calculated, and this was a move that was business related, intelligent and calculated.
It all tracks. It all
Does
tracks.
yeah.
Yeah.
So here's the thing, not a lot of defendants would talk with their lawyers about what the possibility or ramifications are of you dying prior to sentencing.
Hmm.
Most defendants, criminal defendants, can't even think that far,
Hmm.
right? But this guy has built an empire worth $25 million, which tells me he was absolutely able to think that far and did.
Hmm.
So after conferring with his lawyers, he made the best business decision that he could, which was to die before sentencing.
Wow. Wow. Anything else you hear about the case? Any cool stuff?
I mean, the other conspiracy theories, and people have called and asked and emailed and DM'd me. He was gonna rat somebody else out that was much higher, and so they killed him,
Hmm.
but that doesn't make sense for a million reasons, right?
Hmm.
Number one, he never cooperated. Number two, there was no chance of him cooperating because under, you know, Rule 35, even if you cooperate after you're convicted, the government has a year to bring a downward departure motion. There was nothing that he was going to be able to say that was going to bring it down from a life sentence. It didn't, unless he was going to turn in, I mean, even the president of the United States at this point, it wouldn't have mattered had he had information on Trump because he was already a convicted felon. There was
Hmm.
nobody Michael Miske could have turned in order to get a large enough benefit from a Rule 35.
Wow. Interesting.
So,
Huh.
people think there was a bigger conspiracy. He was involved in other things. He was gonna start turning over, state senators and state House of Reps. Like, I mean, I don't see that as an option. I don't see that. And the other thing was Michael Miske was not one to cooperate with the federal government.
Yeah, exactly. He was like a rebel, like against all odds type of rebel to go show you. You know what I mean? That's the vibe that I got from him. Strong. I also wrote in the original newsletter, the one about how I thought he got so poorly treated. Okay, I concede that he's a convicted murder for hire. Like there's so much stuff he did wrong, but I always just took issue was when I was thinking like, hey, according to the law, you could just go ahead, charge the crime. You don't have to add extra stuff to humiliate somebody. Like when they arrested him and set him up, with the whole perp walk, going to his house at 5 in the morning, waiting for the sun to come up and then having him come out. You could have just had him turn in. Mike would have just turned in. If you just reached out to his attorney or him directly and said, oh, hey, we need you to come in. You don't have to bring like dozens and dozens of agents to make a spectacle out of it. So I just took issue with the way that they sort of made a spectacle out of the process of law enforcement. He was gonna go down because of the case. You know what I mean? So that's the only thing I take issue with. You could just charge somebody with the information of the wrongdoing. We don't need to sensationalize it and waste time and resources on trying to like win in the public court of public opinion. I just took issue with that, so I wanted to stick up for him and point out that he was treated poorly by the government, and I'm glad he said a final fuck you to the government. You know what I mean? I once again, I don't think the police are going to be able to use the Ferrari or the boat in legitimate law enforcement. This is just trying to stick a guy and take his assets and take it from his heirs. That's how I see. Yeah, that's how I see it.
Yeah, I mean, I will tell you as a former deputy prosecuting attorney, there are ways to handle situations, and then there are ways to make your office look good and tout things. And I agree with you. I mean, I think everybody should be treated fairly, and I'm not necessarily one to parade around a defendant if I'm law enforcement, but of course, I'm not in charge of any big offices, so it's purely just my opinion.
Okay, so we're gonna send people out on this last question because by proxy, people just ask me because I happen to know you. Um, City Prosecutor, you in, you out, you running again, life good, life bad. What is the latest on you being our next City Prosecutor?
Well, no.
Okay.
No,
No?
but I'll tell you, Nick, I don't even qualify under the city charter. A candidate that runs for city prosecutor has to actively participate in criminal cases. And, while the news and the general public believe that I'm a criminal defense attorney, the large amount of cases that I have are deal with civil litigation instead of criminal. We rarely do criminal defense now. So I would not even qualify for that position.
I guess you're more of a politician than most people might know. Oh, I don't qualify based upon the requirements to even do it. When, hey, if your heart's in it and you want to do it, I just want to let you know that there's a lot of support for you out there. People all the time, especially in Waikiki, where I think they're just sick of like the petty crimes, like the burglaries, the smash and grabs. They all really the idea of charging low-level crimes, which in the grand scheme of things are low level when you say, oh, they're non-violent. I don't know if you have your car broken into and, perhaps you get burglarized, somebody was in your home. That's a big deal to you. It's not a non-violent crime. That message of charging low-level crimes really resonated with people. So if things did, shake out where you wanted to run, I think there's a base of people who would be like really like hardcore supporters.
That's, I am very humbled by people that come up to me and come up to you and talk to me about it. I feel very fortunate. But I'm not a politician. I couldn't run another election. I have a very private life. Um, while it was an extremely rewarding experience for me, it's not something that I would do again.
Ah, okay. So, people who have heard you on this podcast who are impressed with you, I don't see how they're not. What are your specialties now legally? Like, how would I know that I had a matter that I'm like, oh, I need a big gun. Who could I call? What's Megan Cow's specialty now today in 2025?
So now we focus our cases on all civil litigation. Anytime you're fighting over anything civilly, we represent plaintiffs and defendants. So like right now I'm suing IES, which is the parent company of Texaco, for price gouging my clients, the three stations that she has. So, we're looking to get a lot of money from IES because they've treated my client unfairly. Um, we have lawsuits over real estate. When two or more owners have a dispute as to the interest or the outcome of the property, we fight those types of cases. We also do tort cases, um, airlines cases. We had a helicopter death case that we just settled. We've had some excessive force, although I do represent a lot of police officers in criminal cases. If the excessive force is extreme, then we do consider taking the case. We just settled a case 2 years ago now, maybe. Yeah, so anything dealing with civil law.
Okay, very good. So I'm happy that you're at the point in your career because um initially when you're just coming out of an office or you're trying to find your way, you have to find your niche. I'm happy that you've gotten to the point in your career where now you could kind of like specialize in something, be the best in that little niche, and then command like top dollar for complicated, high level matters. And a lot of times I notice with the top attorneys, it's almost like you have to qualify for them to take your case. I can't just call and be like, "Oh, I'm entitled to hire you. I will pay." I'm like, "No, you have to have a case that you're interested in that falls, into your specialty if you want to do it." It's almost like I gotta put my best foot forward to hope that a high level attorney like yourself would take my case. I think that's important for people to hear.
I appreciate that, Nick, because
Mhm.
people do call and they just expect us to take cases. And nowadays with our intake process, there's no way that I can talk to every single person that calls. And
Mm.
so you do have to go through my staff. They have to decide which cases to forward to me because we cannot look at every single case. So, I mean, practically speaking, and procedurally speaking, that's really how it plays out. Although you said it much nicer.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, this has been great. It was awesome to catch up with you. Can't wait to see you in real life sometime, maybe in the courthouse.
I know.
Yeah, thank you for participating in the podcast. Yeah, subscribe to my newsletter. Hire Megan if you have a big deal. All right. Thank
Thank
you.
you, Nick. Thank you for having me.
All right, right on. Thank you. Bye.